My husband cheated on me with his secretary. She's an ugly, useless woman who can't even give me a child, but you satisfy me in every way. I've already spoken to my lawyer, and soon I'll have her out on the street, he told his lover. But the fool overlooked a small detail about my fortune, and that's when I began planning my revenge. Yadira was sitting in front of her computer, her gaze fixed on the screen as she reviewed her husband Carlos's location history for the 10th time. Her fingers trembled slightly as she scrolled through the addresses and times, trying to find a pattern, some clue that would confirm what her intuition had been whispering for weeks. It was 9 o'clock at night, and the house was completely silent. Yadira closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to calm the knot in her chest that made it hard to breathe. Despite the luxury that surrounded her, the success of her career, and the status she shared with Carlos, that night she felt helpless, small, almost invisible. It was as if the prestige and security she had built over the years were suddenly crumbling in front of her. When she heard the sound of the front door opening, her body immediately tensed. Carlos had arrived. Yadira quickly closed the screen and forced herself to smile, hoping her eyes wouldn't betray the whirlwind of emotions she held inside. "Honey, you're already here," she said in a neutral tone as Carlos hung his coat on the entryway hook. "Yeah, the meeting went longer than I expected," he responded, walking past her without even looking and heading straight to the kitchen to pour himself a glass of wine. Yadira watched him in silence, every move, every gesture, both familiar and, at the same time, strange. She wondered when his presence had stopped being a comfort and had become a frightening enigma. The man she had shared decades with now seemed like a complete stranger. Carlos approached her and, with a carefree smile, handed her the glass he had poured for her. "Did you have a good day?" he asked, as if it were just another night. Yadira forced a smile, taking the glass and avoiding his gaze. "Yes, it was quite calm. I was reviewing some company documents, nothing out of the ordinary." Carlos nodded, taking a long sip of wine and settling into the armchair across from her. For a few minutes, silence settled between them, only interrupted by the sound of the glass touching the glass table. "And you?" Yadira asked, trying to keep her voice as casual as possible. "How was the meeting?" Carlos sighed, as if the weight of the day had worn him out. The same as always. Budget problems, pointless discussions. "You know how it is," he replied dismissively. "Sometimes I think I'd lose my mind if I didn't have someone at the office who truly understands the chaos of that company." Yadira picked up on the affectionate tone with which he uttered those last words, and a spark of bitterness ignited within her. She knew exactly who he was referring to. Evelyn, the young secretary who had been promoted a few months ago and who had since seemed to occupy a special place in Carlos's life. The late nights at work, the calls after hours, and the increasingly frequent excuses were becoming unbearable. "Evelyn must be a great help, then," Yadira murmured, trying to keep her tone casual. Carlos shrugged, trying to hide the smile that crept onto his lips. "She's a smart girl. She's proven to be very efficient and understanding. It's hard to find people like that these days." Yadira felt a pang of pain. It irked her the way he talked about Evelyn, as if she were more than just an employee, as if she understood something Yadira couldn't. For years, Yadira had worked by his side, pushing his ambitions, supporting him in each of his projects. And now, there he was, praising another woman as if she were indispensable. Clutching the glass in her hands, Yadira forced a smile, as if she agreed with his words. "It's good to know you have someone trustworthy," she said softly, though each word tasted like poison. Carlos nodded, satisfied, and changed the subject without noticing the tension on his wife's face. Yadira forced herself to relax, to keep calm. She knew that conversation was not the moment to confront him, not when her heart was still pounding from seeing the location records. Hours later, when Carlos had already gone to bed, Yadira remained in the study, looking at the small box of the tracker she kept in her desk drawer. The idea of placing that device in Carlos's car made her feel both repulsed and guilty, but it was her only chance to uncover the truth. With tired eyes, she remembered a conversation from years ago when she and Carlos had talked about their dreams and life projects. She remembered how he used to swear he would never betray her, that wealth and success would never stand above their relationship. But now, all those promises seemed distant and hollow, replaced by a cold and distant reality. Determined, Yadira took the tracker and quietly headed toward the garage. The shadows of the night enveloped her as she placed the device in her husband's car, hiding it carefully so he would never notice it. It was a step she couldn't undo, and she knew it well. As she returned inside the house, an inexplicable chill ran through her, but an iron determination kept her standing. Upon entering the bedroom, Carlos was sleeping deeply, oblivious to the doubts and anguish Yadira carried in her chest. She sat at the edge of the bed and observed him in silence, wondering what was real about this man with whom she shared her life. "What are you hiding from me, Carlos?" she whispered, as if hoping her barely audible voice could extract some answer from his dreams. But Carlos didn't move, and the silence of the night was the only response. The next day, the silence of the morning was broken by the sound of notifications on Yadira's phone. She had stayed up all night, watching from her room every time Carlos moved or murmured in his sleep. She sat up slowly, trying not to wake her husband, and headed to the bathroom with her phone in hand. There, in the dim light, she checked the location history of the tracker she had placed the previous night. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw that Carlos hadn't made any suspicious moves. He had gone to work, made a brief stop at a nearby store, and then returned home. For a second, a small spark of hope lit up in her heart. What if she had been wrong? Maybe it was all just a misunderstanding, the result of her own fears and insecurities. But deep down, Yadira knew that these fears weren't unfounded. The next morning, Carlos announced that he would be leaving the house early, claiming he had an important meeting with a new client. "This week has been crazy, honey. I promise that next week we can take a few days to rest," Carlos said, with a smile that seemed sincere. But Yadira felt the weight of his words like a broken promise. "Sure, Carlos, don't worry," she replied, forcing a smile. "Make sure you don't overdo it." When the door closed behind him, Yadira allowed herself a moment to catch her breath. She couldn't help but look at the clock, counting down the minutes to see where he would go. With every passing second, her anxiety grew. It was a silent and bitter wait, marked by the anticipation of finally discovering the truth. Hours later, the tracker began to show activity. Carlos had left the office much earlier than he had told her. The coordinates indicated he was headed toward a residential area of the city, far from the zone he usually frequented. "What are you doing, Carlos?" Yadira murmured, feeling the knot in her stomach tighten further. With steely determination, she put on a coat, grabbed her car keys, and set off toward the destination. She drove in silence, her mind flooded with possibilities, each more painful than the last. Finally, she found herself in front of a single-story house, modest but well-kept. From her car window, she watched as Carlos got out of his car, knocked on the door, and was greeted by a young woman with shining hair and a radiant smile. "Evelyn." Yadira felt her heart pounding in her chest. As she watched the scene, she felt a mix of disbelief and pain. Evelyn looked radiant, dressed in a simple yet elegant dress, and greeted Carlos with a hug that seemed too intimate to be just a casual greeting. At that moment, Yadira noticed a small boy with dark hair and expressive eyes running out of the house towards them. "Daddy, Daddy," the boy shouted excitedly. Yadira felt a blow to her stomach, a dizzying sensation that left her breathless. The word "daddy" echoed in her mind like an endless echo. She watched as Carlos lifted the boy in his arms, hugged him, and kissed him on the forehead, while Evelyn watched the scene tenderly. The image was perfect, like a family postcard that had no place in her life. Amid the whirlwind of emotions, Yadira forced herself to hold back her tears. She couldn't allow herself to lose control, not there, not at that moment. She needed all her strength to endure that scene, to witness how her husband, the man she had placed her trust and love in, was living a double life. Thoughts crowded her mind. The lie, the deceit, the betrayal. The truth was there, before her eyes, and it was far more painful than she could ever have imagined. Determined to get answers, Yadira got out of the car and walked to the house's entrance. Her heart was pounding, but her steps were firm, determined. Just as she reached the door, Evelyn noticed her presence and, with a look of surprise, released Carlos's arm. "Yadira?" Carlos stammered, completely bewildered, not knowing how to react. "So this is the important meeting?" Yadira asked, with a calm that chilled the air. Carlos tried to say something, but the words got stuck in his throat. Evelyn, for her part, looked at Yadira with a mix of fear and shame. At that moment, the boy ran to Evelyn, grabbing her hand. "Mom, who is she?" The boy asked curiously. Evelyn bent down to the little one, gently stroking his hair. She's a friend of Daddy's, dear, she replied with a tense smile, trying to ease the tension of the situation. Yadira felt the air around her becoming unbreathable. A friend of Daddy? That simple phrase tore her apart. It was as if her entire being was trapped in a storm of emotions she couldn't control. Carlos, can we talk alone? Yadira asked, trying to keep her composure. Carlos, shoulders slumped and with a defeated expression, nodded and stepped away a few paces from Evelyn and the boy. Both headed to the side of the house, where no one else could hear them. The tension was palpable. How long have you been living this lie? Yadira asked, with a voice so cold that she didn't even recognize it herself. Carlos sighed, running a hand over his face, avoiding her gaze. Yadira, it wasn't something I planned. At first, I just wanted to escape a bit, to find something that made me feel different. You and I, we've had our differences, and with Evelyn, he paused, searching for the words. Things just happened. Yadira looked at him, unable to believe the coldness of his words. Happened? She repeated, feeling anger beginning to boil inside her. You call this just happening? Carlos, you have a family, a son. A son I could never give you. Carlos avoided her gaze, unable to face the pain he saw reflected in Yadira's eyes. It's not that simple, Yadira. Things between us have changed. I've tried to be the husband you need, but with Evelyn, it's different. It's not something you can understand. The coldness of his words left her frozen. At that moment, Yadira understood that the man standing in front of her, the one who had been her life partner, had become a stranger, someone she didn't know and probably never really knew. You're right, Carlos. I can't understand it. Nor do I want to, she said firmly, turning around and walking away, leaving Carlos in the middle of his own lie. She returned to the car, closed the door, and as she started the engine, tears finally slid down her face, silent but laden with immense sadness. Looking one last time at the house in the rearview mirror, she felt as if she was leaving something behind that she would never regain. As she drove, her mind kept replaying what had happened. She had lost not only her husband, but also her dignity, her trust, and the life she had built. But in the midst of the pain, a spark of strength began to ignite within her. She knew she still had much to face, but this time, she would do it her way. Yadira woke up at dawn, the echo of the previous night still resonating in her mind. She had barely slept, caught in a spiral of thoughts and memories revolving around Carlos's betrayal and the image of Evelyn and their child. She got up, gazing at her reflection in the mirror. Her eyes, once filled with serenity and confidence, now showed a mixture of pain and determination. As she descended the stairs, her phone vibrated on the table. It was a message from an unknown number. I know what you found out. I'm sorry. Evelyn. The coldness with which those words reached her was a brutal reminder of the complexity of what she was going through. Evelyn knew. She knew that Yadira had seen her, that she had been discovered, and apparently, the woman felt the need to apologize, though Yadira doubted that a simple apology could lessen the weight of her betrayal. Yadira stared at the message for a long time before responding, feeling the intensity of her emotions gathering at her fingertips. Meet me today at the cafe on the main square. 8 sharp. Don't be late, she wrote without adding anything else. This time, she wasn't going to let Evelyn escape with a superficial apology. Hours later, Yadira arrived at the cafe. She dressed with her usual understated elegance, but her face was hardened, and her posture reflected the strength of someone ready to face any storm. She sat at a table near the window, where the noise from the street barely intruded into the cafe's ambience, and she waited. It didn't take long before she saw Evelyn enter. Upon seeing her, Evelyn walked over with an expression of remorse on her face. She was beautiful, with that youth and freshness that reminded Yadira of the days when she, too, believed in her husband's love and fidelity. Thank you for coming, Yadira, Evelyn said quietly, sitting down across the table. Yadira observed her in silence, allowing her discomfort to spread through the air. She wanted Evelyn to feel the weight of what she had done, to know that she couldn't justify her betrayal so easily. I spoke with Carlos, Yadira finally said, in a controlled tone. He explained your role in his life. Evelyn lowered her gaze, nervously twisting her hands in her lap. I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness. But she paused, searching for words. I want you to know that I never meant to hurt you. I didn't know Carlos was married when we started. I found out later, and by then it was too late. I fell in love with him, Yadira. Yadira looked at her with a mixture of compassion and anger. In love? How could this woman talk about love when she had been complicit in the most painful betrayal Yadira had ever experienced? In love? Yadira repeated with bitter irony in her voice. Tell me, Evelyn, do you realize the destruction you've caused? Not only in my life, but in yours as well. Because I want you to know one thing. Carlos was never yours. Did you really think you could take what I built over years with such a hollow excuse? Evelyn seemed to shrink in her chair, her face flushing with shame. I didn't plan this, Yadira. When I found out about you, I already had our child. I didn't want to leave him, and Carlos said he had told you everything that you knew, that you had accepted our relationship. Those words sparked a flame of fury in Yadira. Carlos's lie was even deeper than she had imagined, a complex game of manipulation he had used to maintain 2 lives, 2 families. Accepted? Yadira responded, struggling to stay calm. I never accepted and would never accept such a betrayal, Evelyn. You believed his lie, which makes you naive, but not innocent. She paused, locking her gaze with Evelyn's. Now listen closely. I won't let Carlos get away with this. If you thought the money and status he gave you would be enough, let me remind you who I am. Evelyn swallowed, feeling the weight of Yadira's words. Deep down, they both knew this situation was unsustainable, that Carlos's double life couldn't continue without someone getting hurt. What do you plan to do, Yadira? Evelyn asked, with a mixture of fear and submission in her voice. Yadira took a deep breath, regaining the control she had struggled so hard to maintain. She was determined to make Carlos feel every pain, every loss. I want him to understand that he can't manipulate either you or me. You want his love, but I'm going to take away what truly matters to him, his power, his reputation, his money. And when he is completely stripped of everything, it will be me who decides his fate. Evelyn looked at her in silence, realizing that Yadira meant every word. There was something in the intensity of her gaze that made Evelyn feel that, for the first time in a long while, she had underestimated a woman who, though wounded, was stronger than anyone could imagine. At the end of the conversation, Yadira left without another word, leaving Evelyn engulfed in a mixture of fear and doubt. The young woman understood that her decision to remain by Carlos's side, to keep this forbidden relationship, had now put her in a situation from which she might not be able to escape. That very afternoon, Yadira began to prepare her revenge. She met with her trusted lawyer and explained the situation, omitting certain details to keep her reputation intact, but making her intentions clear. I want Carlos to lose control over all our shared properties, Yadira said, with a tone of certainty that surprised the lawyer. He looked at her with some concern, but he understood that this situation went beyond a simple separation. Are you sure, Yadira? This could be a long and painful process. She nodded without a second of hesitation. Carlos thought he could betray me, so I will make sure he knows what it's like to be left with nothing. And I want Evelyn to know that if she decides to stay by his side, she will have to do so without the luxuries he offered her. They don't deserve to enjoy anything that comes from my effort or the life I built. The lawyer nodded, understanding the intensity of her words. Very well, then I'll begin preparing the documents. It might take some time, but we'll do our best to ensure that this process leaves him vulnerable. As she said goodbye to her lawyer, Yadira felt a strange mix of pain and release. She knew this decision would destabilize her life, but it would also help her regain control over herself. For the first time in a long time, she had a clear purpose, to expose Carlos and reveal each of his lies. That night, when she arrived home, she found Carlos waiting in the living room with an expression of apparent concern on his face. Where were you, Yadira? You haven't responded to my messages, he said, trying to sound casual, though the tension in his voice was evident. She looked at him, allowing herself to smile for the first time in days. It was a smile full of knowledge of someone who was no longer fooled. Carlos, from now on you'll have plenty of time to worry about my activities because soon that will be all you have left. She leaned towards him without breaking eye contact. I don't need your love or your lies. I just came to warn you that this game is over. And this time, I make the rules. Carlos opened his mouth, confused, but Yadira was no longer there to hear his excuses. As she climbed the stairs, she understood that she had taken the first step towards her freedom. She knew it wouldn't be easy and that she would face many more nights of loneliness and tears, but she also knew that each moment of struggle would allow her to regain the dignity and strength she had long thought lost. Deep within her, a fire ignited, driven by the determination of a woman who was no longer afraid to be herself. It was around 5 in the afternoon when Carlos, as he did every week, said goodbye to Evelyn with a hurried kiss and looked at his son, Ricardo, 6 years old, who was playing in the corner of the room. Ricardo looked up at the sound of the door closing, then looked back at his mother. The previous night, while pretending to be asleep in his room, he overheard a conversation between his parents that left him uneasy. Evelyn and Carlos were arguing in low voices, but for a curious and perceptive child like Ricardo, the key words were enough to alarm him. "Carlos, you need to make sure Yadira doesn't find out what we're planning. If she learns everything, she'll leave you with nothing," Evelyn said urgently. Carlos sighed with a calculated resignation. "I know, Evelyn. I'll have to keep pretending and tell her what she wants to hear. Otherwise, we'll end up on the street." Ricardo didn't fully understand what those words meant, but a chill ran through his small body as he heard the concern in his mother's voice and the tone of his father. He had never considered the possibility of losing his father, of seeing him go away, but that idea weighed on him, an inexplicable fear he hadn't been able to shake since then. The next day, when he saw his father leave, Ricardo made an impulsive decision. Without thinking twice, he ran to the garage and carefully hid in the car's trunk before Carlos shut the door. He stayed there, barely breathing and staying still as the car moved toward an unknown destination. About 20 minutes later, the car stopped. Ricardo heard his father get out, close the car door, and walk away. He waited a few minutes to make sure Carlos wouldn't return soon, then opened the trunk, getting out carefully. He observed the large house in front of him, with a beautiful garden that greeted him with vibrant colors. He approached the door, feeling a bit intimidated, but with the determination of a child who had made a decision. He rang the doorbell timidly and waited. Yadira, who was in the kitchen at that moment serving herself a cup of tea, raised her head in surprise at the sound of the doorbell. She wasn't expecting any visitors, and the hour made it unlikely that someone from the staff would arrive without prior notice. She walked to the door and opened it, finding a figure she could never have imagined. Ricardo, still in his wrinkled school uniform and with disheveled hair, looked at her with big eyes full of uncertainty. "You're Yadira, right?" he asked in a whisper. Yadira nodded, somewhat confused. "Yes, I'm Yadira." "You are?" She looked at the boy, recognizing some familiar features in his face that gave her a pang in her chest. "You're Ricardo, aren't you?" He nodded, with his gaze lowered, then raised it toward her, trying to hold back the tears that were beginning to show. "I came to see you because I need to ask you something important," he said in a low voice, nervously clasping his small hands. Yadira bent down a bit to be at his level, looking at him with a mix of surprise and tenderness. "What do you need, Ricardo? Why aren't you at home with your mom?" she asked, with a gentle tone that tried to calm him. Ricardo looked at her with a desperate glint in his eyes. The image of his schoolmate, a boy who had suffered greatly after his father left them, came to mind. "I don't want to be left without my dad," he confessed, in a whisper that broke Yadira's heart. "My friend at school, his dad left, and he cries every day. I don't want to go through that. I don't want my dad to leave forever." Yadira felt a tear slide down her cheek. The pain of that boy, mixed with her own sadness and disillusionment, made her step back. It was a bitter reminder of the lives Carlos was ruining, not only hers, but also that of this little boy who bore no fault for the choices made by the adults around him. "Ricardo," she began, with a knot in her throat. I don't want to hurt you. What's happening between your dad and me is complicated, but it has nothing to do with you. You're a good and special child, and no one should make you suffer." Ricardo took a step forward, clutching Yadira's hand with the innocence and desperation characteristic of his age. "So, will you promise not to leave me without a dad?" he pleaded, his voice trembling with fear. "Could you talk to him and ask him not to go? Mom says you're important to him, and I know he listens to you too." Ricardo's words were like a dagger to Yadira, who understood that this boy was an innocent victim of all the manipulation Carlos was putting him through. She took a deep breath, trying to find the right words, those that might console him without giving him false hope. "Listen, Ricardo," she said, keeping her tone gentle but firm. "Sometimes adults make hard choices, and sometimes those choices bring us pain. But what I promise you is that your dad will always be with you, in one way or another. He loves you, and he will never abandon you." Ricardo looked at her with teary eyes, his little heart struggling to process those words that sounded so uncertain. It wasn't the answer he had hoped for, but the warmth in Yadira's voice gave him some comfort. "So, you won't make him go away?" he asked with a hopeful tone. Yadira managed a sad smile and gently patted his head. "I'll do the best I can, Ricardo. I promise. But you need to understand that your dad and I..." She paused, searching for a way to explain something so complex to a child. "We're on different paths, and sometimes that means we have to make hard choices. But no matter what happens, you will always be loved." The boy nodded slowly, as if those words gave him the strength needed to bear what lay ahead. In his innocence, he clung to Yadira's promise, not fully grasping its meaning, but feeling deep down that she was speaking the truth. "Thank you, Yadira," he finally said, letting go of her hand and lowering his head, as if suddenly feeling embarrassed for having come to her. Yadira smiled and bent down to look him in the eyes. "You don't need to thank me, Ricardo. You're a very brave boy. Now, why don't I take you back home?" Ricardo nodded with a sigh of relief. The weight on his small heart had lifted, if only a little. Yadira accompanied him to the car, and on the way, he gazed out the window in silence, with a pensive expression. For him, that brief encounter had been more important than anyone could imagine. He had come to Yadira with the desire to protect his family, to find hope in the midst of confusion, and though he didn't fully understand the complexities of adults, he felt she had at least told him the truth. As she dropped him off at the corner of his house, Yadira gave him a final look, silently wishing him all the happiness and protection he deserved. She watched as Ricardo ran toward his house and disappeared inside, while a knot of intense and contradictory emotions swirled in her chest. For the first time, Yadira understood the magnitude of her decision and the scope of her actions. Not only had she been betrayed, but that betrayal had ramifications much deeper than she had ever imagined. But though her own heart was broken, she now knew she would have to be strong, for her struggle was no longer just about reclaiming her dignity. She had promised to protect Ricardo in one way or another, and she would do everything in her power to ensure the boy wouldn't suffer for his father's mistakes. The following days passed in a tense silence. Yadira tried to process what had happened with Ricardo while continuing with the legal arrangements she had started. Every morning, she woke up with a mix of determination and pain, trying to ensure that this innocent and confused child didn't become another victim of the web of lies Carlos had spun. Ricardo's visit had awakened a compassion in her that she hadn't felt in a long time. Ironically, that child, the product of her husband's betrayal, had become one of the few reasons that kept her from completely destroying him. Each day that passed, the struggle between resentment and the need to protect Ricardo intensified within her. One afternoon, while reviewing documents in her office, her phone rang. It was her lawyer. "Yadira, I have good news. I managed to freeze a significant portion of the joint funds and assets in Carlos's name. This will limit his financial moves in the coming months, as you requested," he said, with a tone of satisfaction. Yadira nodded, feeling a strange satisfaction. This was only the beginning of her plan. However, her thoughts turned once more to Ricardo and the promise she had made to him. "Thank you, Daniel. I appreciate your help with all of this. I need to make sure Carlos understands that he can't use me, or anyone else, to get what he wants." The lawyer paused, as if hesitating to speak. "Are you sure you want to proceed, Yadira? The repercussions could be severe. Carlos isn't the kind of man to give up without a fight, and this could worsen things, especially for that child." Daniel's words echoed in her mind, reminding her of how much was at stake. She knew that Ricardo shouldn't suffer, but she also understood that she couldn't let Carlos go unpunished. I know, Daniel. I'll do what's necessary to protect Ricardo, she said, with a determination that surprised the lawyer. That same night, while she was going over her plans, an unexpected message came to her phone. I need to see you. There are things you don't know. Evelyn. Yadira hesitated before responding, wondering if she really wanted to hear what Evelyn had to say. However, something inside her urged her to accept. Perhaps she needed to better understand the motivations of the woman who had changed her life without even realizing the harm she caused. Hours later, Yadira was in a quiet cafe where Evelyn awaited her with a look of discomfort and nervousness. Upon seeing her, Yadira maintained her composed expression, hiding any trace of vulnerability. Thank you for coming, Yadira. I know you have no reason to trust me, but this is important, Evelyn began. Not looking at her directly, Yadira observed her in silence, waiting for her to continue. Listen, I know Carlos deceived you, but you don't know the whole truth. Carlos isn't just an unfaithful man. He manipulates and uses people for his own benefit. He cares about nothing but his money and power. I realized it too late, but I know I was a pawn in his game, just like you. Yadira narrowed her eyes, studying every word Evelyn said, trying to decipher if this was sincerity or a strategy to win her sympathy. And now what? Yadira asked coldly. Why should I care what Carlos has done to you? You took away what I valued most, and now you're here asking for understanding. Evelyn sighed, clasping her hands on the table. I'm not here to ask for forgiveness, Yadira. I'm here to warn you. Carlos plans to take everything, including your share of the assets. He's talked to his lawyer and is looking for ways to legally strip you of your properties. If he succeeds, he'll leave you with nothing, not even a chance to defend yourself. Evelyn's words were like a slap, and though Yadira had imagined Carlos might try something like this, the confirmation filled her with a mix of rage and sadness. She had shared everything with him, her dreams, her trust, her life, and now Carlos was trying to take even that. And what do you expect from me, Evelyn? Yadira asked, looking at her intently. You want us to trust each other? To join forces against him? Evelyn looked at her with an unexpected intensity. I know I have no right to ask for your help, but the truth is, you're the only person who can confront him. If we work together, we could make sure he doesn't get away with it. This isn't just about me or you. It's about Ricardo, too. He deserves to have a decent life, far from his father's lies and manipulations. Yadira felt her walls begin to crumble. Evelyn was right about one thing. Ricardo deserved a better life, and it was in her hands to protect him from a future filled with betrayals. Very well, Evelyn. We'll work together, but this is not a truce. I'm doing this only for Ricardo, she responded, trying to keep her voice firm. Evelyn nodded, relieved, and they began to devise a plan. They analyzed every possible move Carlos could make, every resource he might use to weaken them, and sought to anticipate each of his plays. Yadira knew this wouldn't be easy, but Evelyn's presence, though uncomfortable, also gave her the certainty that this time, she had a chance to expose Carlos. Days later, as they implemented their plan, Carlos began to notice the changes. Documents that had previously been at his disposal now required authorizations. Funds he had used without restrictions were frozen, and his lawyer began to show concern. One night, Carlos confronted Yadira in the living room of their house. His eyes, always so calculating, now showed a mix of surprise and irritation. What are you doing, Yadira? He asked with a controlled but furious tone. She remained calm, observing him with a calculated serenity. I'm simply making sure everything is in order, Carlos. I wouldn't want someone else using what I built without my permission. Carlos clenched his jaw, barely concealing his frustration. I don't know what you think you're achieving with this, but I assure you, you have no idea what you're up against. I can destroy you. Yadira looked him straight in the eyes, not flinching. Try, Carlos. You have no idea what I'm capable of now that I have nothing left to lose. Carlos seemed surprised by the intensity of her words, and for an instant, Yadira saw a flicker of doubt in his gaze. It was the first time she had seen him unsure, and that small victory gave her the strength she needed. As he left the room, Yadira felt that the power was finally beginning to shift. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but now she had a motivation beyond revenge or betrayal. She was doing it for Ricardo, for that silent promise to protect him from his father's ambition and selfishness. At the end of the night, Yadira allowed herself to smile. She knew there was still much to do, but in her heart, she felt a spark of hope, one that would drive her forward, facing each challenge with the conviction that, this time, Carlos would not be the one to win. Days later, as Yadira reviewed the documents she had obtained with her lawyer's help and the evidence Evelyn had provided, she began to clearly see a pattern. Something didn't add up in the relationship between Carlos and Evelyn, details that Evelyn had mentioned in their recent meetings, sparking in Yadira a deep suspicion. That man hadn't only betrayed her, he had woven a web of lies to manipulate Evelyn as well. One afternoon, while reviewing a message from Evelyn in which she described how Carlos had convinced her to continue their relationship, Yadira noticed a phrase that sent a chill down her spine. "Carlos told me you were already out of his life. That his marriage to you was just a convenience arrangement to keep the company." That statement, so cynical and calculated, revealed the extent of Carlos's manipulation. Determined to confirm her suspicions, Yadira decided to confront Evelyn once more, this time with the truth, however harsh it might be. Hours later, they met in a small cafe where they could talk without interruptions. Evelyn, somewhat tense, looked at Yadira, still feeling guilty for her role in the story. "Evelyn, there's something I need to clarify with you, and I want you to be completely honest," said Yadira, in a serious but firm tone. Evelyn nodded, looking at Yadira with eyes full of uncertainty. "Tell me, Yadira. I have nothing left to hide." Yadira took a deep breath, trying to control her tone before she spoke the following words. "I want to know exactly what Carlos told you about our marriage. I need to understand how he manipulated you. Tell me what he said to keep you by his side." Evelyn looked down, as if it still hurt her to remember those words. After a moment of silence, she spoke in a low voice, as if reliving the deception. "Carlos told me that you two weren't really together anymore. He said that you had an arrangement to maintain the appearance of marriage only for the business. He assured me that there had been no love between you for a long time and that you knew this. That you had accepted it because it was convenient for you to keep up that image." Yadira felt a sharp pain in her chest. That well-calculated lie had been enough to fool Evelyn and keep her in that unscrupulous relationship. "Did he tell you he was divorced?" asked Yadira, trying to keep her voice steady. Evelyn nodded, looking at Yadira with sadness. "Yes, he told me he was divorced, but that for convenience and business matters, he still lived with you. He even assured me that you knew about our relationship and that you had accepted it. He made me believe that you were completely fine with keeping up this charade." A heavy silence settled between them. Yadira felt that revelation burning inside her, a mix of rage and compassion for Evelyn. The young woman had been as much a victim of Carlos as she herself had been, deceived and manipulated by this same man who wouldn't hesitate to do whatever it took to get his way. "Evelyn, Carlos never divorced me. Never. Everything he told you was a lie to keep you close, to make sure you wouldn't leave him," said Yadira, in a firm voice, watching the impact of her words on Evelyn's face. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. She had lived deceived, convinced that Carlos loved her and that their relationship had a legitimacy that never existed. "No. I can't believe it!" "So everything was a lie?" whispered Evelyn, her face falling apart. Yadira nodded, trying to control the fury building inside her. "Carlos is a man who has built his life on lies, Evelyn. He manipulated you just as he did me, just as he does everyone else. He only cares about his own convenience, and if that means destroying our lives in the process, he won't hesitate to do it." Evelyn lowered her head, her shoulders trembling. The young woman seemed to lose strength, and for the first time, Yadira felt genuine compassion for her. "Evelyn, I want you to understand something. What happened between us, it can't keep hurting us. We can't let Carlos have that power over our lives. You're young, You have the chance to get out of this situation and protect your son. Don't let yourself be trapped in Carlos's game." Evelyn looked at her, tears in her eyes, nodding slowly. "You're right, Yadira. I was a fool to believe in him, to accept his lies without questioning him. But now that I know the truth, I want to do something to stop him. For Ricardo, for you, and for myself." Yadira noticed a spark of determination in Evelyn's eyes. She understood that, despite the pain, this young woman had gained a new strength, one they could use in their counterattack. Evelyn held out her hand, and Yadira, after a second of hesitation, took it. That act symbolized an agreement, a truce. United by the same betrayal, both women committed to protecting what Carlos had tried to take from them. That same night, Yadira and Evelyn planned their next move. Carlos's betrayal would not go unpunished, and the two women, with renewed determination, promised to protect Ricardo and strip Carlos of what he valued most, his power and control. The strength born from their alliance, a force forged from pain and betrayal, would become the most powerful weapon to face Carlos. A few days later, the morning dawned serene and warm, as if the weather had decided to reflect the calm that was finally taking root in Yadira's heart. After weeks of confrontations, uncovering betrayals, and facing painful truths, today felt different. It was time to close a chapter, to leave the past behind, and to build a new life, not only for herself, but also for Ricardo and, in some way, for Evelyn. The legal battle had ended in her favor. With the strategy she had crafted alongside Evelyn, they had managed to get Carlos to relinquish the shared properties and a significant part of the business funds, which were redirected to an account under Yadira's control. This wasn't an act of revenge, but rather the justice she had sought so fervently, and the closing of a chapter marked by deception. Carlos, with no options or allies, had withdrawn in silence, knowing his words no longer held power over the people he had once deceived. That afternoon, Yadira invited Evelyn and Ricardo to a small celebration in the garden of her home, a space she now felt was truly hers. She decorated the terrace with flowers and warm lights and set a simple but elegant table. Evelyn arrived with Ricardo, who, upon seeing Yadira, ran to her with a smile that melted her heart. "Yadira," he exclaimed, hugging her with all the trust he had placed in her over the past few weeks. Yadira crouched down to embrace him, feeling a mix of joy and hope. Ricardo had been her salvation in the storm, a reason to stay strong and find peace amidst the chaos. "I'm so happy you came, Ricardo," she said, gently running her fingers through his hair. "Today, we're celebrating something very special." Ricardo looked up at her with curious eyes. "What are we celebrating?" Yadira smiled, glancing at Evelyn, who stood a bit farther away with a serene and grateful expression. "Today, we're celebrating a new beginning, Ricardo. Because sometimes, after difficult moments, we're given the chance to start fresh. And this is our chance to be happy." Evelyn approached and took a seat, her face showing a smile full of gratitude. She, too, had gone through her own transformation, and in the end, she had gained something she had never imagined, a peace that didn't depend on Carlos or the lies he had built. "Yadira, I want to thank you, not only for what you did for Ricardo, but for what you helped me discover in myself," Evelyn said sincerely. "I don't know what I would have done without your support." Yadira nodded, looking at her with empathy. She had learned to see Evelyn not as the cause of her problems, but as someone who, like herself, had been a victim of Carlos's manipulation. "Evelyn, what happened is in the past. Now we both have the chance to do something different. And I wish you all the happiness and strength to achieve the future you deserve." Evelyn smiled, nodding, and in that moment, the two women understood that there would be no more resentment or blame between them. They had turned their wounds into bridges of compassion and respect, something even Carlos could never undo. As the afternoon wore on, Yadira watched Ricardo run among the flowers, laughing and playing with a freedom that filled the air with joy. He was a reflection of what she felt herself, a new peace, a sense that she had finally found the place she needed. As the sun began to set, Ricardo came up to her and took her hand. "You know, Yadira? I'm so glad you didn't let me be without a dad," he said in an innocent voice. Yadira knelt down and looked into his eyes, understanding that this child's fear had been the spark that had pushed her to face everything. But now, he could grow up without that shadow, without the fear of losing someone important. "Ricardo, you'll never be alone. You'll always have people who care for you and love you, okay? That will never change." The boy nodded, smiling with a pure joy, and in that moment, Yadira felt her own life fill with purpose. She had done the right thing, and that gave her a satisfaction that went far beyond the victory over Carlos. She had found her true strength and the ability to be happy without relying on anyone else. Night fell over the garden, and the twinkling lights illuminated the space with a warmth that enveloped everyone present. Yadira, Evelyn, and Ricardo shared a simple meal, full of laughter and sincere conversations. It was an ending she hadn't imagined, but one that now felt like the best possible. When Evelyn and Ricardo said their goodbyes, Yadira watched them as they walked away. She didn't know what the future held for each of them, but something deep inside her told her that everything would be all right. As she closed the door and turned off the garden lights, Yadira felt a deep peace that had eluded her for years. She finally understood that true strength wasn't in avoiding pain, but in facing it and learning to grow from it. She had found the freedom she had longed for and, above all, the self-love she would never set aside again. Life now offered her a new path, one where her happiness would depend on no one but herself. If this story resonated with you, I invite you to leave a comment about how it made you feel, and if you've experienced a similar situation of betrayal, I'd be honored to hear your valuable thoughts. I would be thrilled if you could give it a like, share the video with a friend or family member, and subscribe to the channel. Don't miss the next amazing story appearing on your screen now. We have exclusive entertainment just for you. See you in the next video.